There was a time when food did not begin in soil. That may sound unfamiliar now. We picture fields laid out in straight lines, boots pressing into earth, a calendar deciding when the work should begin. We've grown used to believing that nourishment must rise from dirt. But some harvests began on quiet water, and for generations no one thought that was unusual. In the early morning, when the surface was still enough to reflect the sky, people moved carefully. Not quickly, not loudly. There were no engines waiting, no schedules to keep. Just the gentle drift forward, the soft touch of wood, and the sound of something ready choosing to fall. Nothing was forced into rows. Nothing was asked to hurry. The water carried the season, and the hands followed where it led. What was taken came freely, and only when it was ready to be given. Over time, that way of growing became harder to picture. We learned to trust firmness under our feet. We learned to prefer what could be planned, measured, and stored without surprise. And little by little we forgot there were foods that never belonged to land at all. Somewhere between certainty and speed, a quieter memory slipped beneath the surface, unbroken but unseen, waiting for someone to remember where it truly lived. It was not a curiosity, but a center. For centuries, long before straight borders or written records, people in the Great Lakes region oriented their lives around water. Lakes and slow rivers were not obstacles to cross. They were pathways, calendars, and teachers. When the water shifted, people adjusted. When it rested, they waited. This grain belonged to that world. Historical accounts and indigenous oral histories describe a harvest that returned each year without being planted. In late summer, when the light softened and mornings carried a thin mist, families moved onto the water in narrow canoes. 2 people shared each boat. One guided quietly. The other carried smooth wooden sticks, bending the tall grasses inward. With gentle taps, ripe grains loosened and fell, some into the canoe, some back into the water saved for the season ahead. This was not efficiency as we know it now. It was continuity. The work had a rhythm shaped by attention. You could hear the grains land one by one. You could smell fresh water and sun-warmed stems. Children learned by watching the pace of adult hands. Elders watched the water line and said little. The method mattered because it protected what would return next year. Roots were left untouched. The water remained clear. The harvest renewed itself. Anthropologists later documented what had long been practiced. This grain sustained communities through winters when gardens slept and hunting was uncertain. It was dried, parched, and stored with care. It appeared at gatherings and ceremonies because it had fed people reliably year after year. It was not rare, it was dependable. No one thought of it as traditional or ancient. It did not need explanation. It was simply food that grew where water allowed it, feeding people who understood how to listen. Only much later, when life began to reorganize around different expectations, did this way of harvesting start to feel unfamiliar. And when that happened, few realized they were witnessing the quiet fading of something that had once been essential. The world around it was quietly reorganizing. The shift did not come with a single decision or a clear moment of loss. It arrived gradually as the pace of life changed and food was asked to meet new expectations. After the middle of the 20th century, agriculture across the United States began moving toward scale. Fields grew larger. Harvests were timed more precisely. Machines replaced many of the tasks once guided by hands and seasons. This was the first change in rhythm. Large equipment needed ground that stayed firm and predictable. Wheels required dry access. Schedules depended on consistency. Grains that grew on solid land adapted easily to this way of working. A plant that lived in shallow water did not. Manoomin followed water levels, not calendars. Its edges shifted with the season. It asked farmers to move with it, not over it. Water does not resist. It simply refuses to be rushed. The second change came with uniformity. As food systems expanded, crops were expected to behave the same way at the same time. Fields ripened together. Harvests moved as a single event. This made planning possible on a large scale. Manoomin had never worked like that. Some stalks matured early, others waited. Harvest was spread out, guided by observation rather than instruction. Uniformity simplified logistics. Nature kept its own pace. The third change was quieter, but just as decisive. Food was no longer judged only by whether it nourished. It was judged by how easily it could be dried, transported, stored, and prepared. Kitchens changed. Meals became faster. Ingredients that required watching, turning, and patience became harder to justify in daily life. This grain demanded attention after harvest. It rewarded care, but it did not offer shortcuts. Over time, attention became more costly than speed. None of this happened because the grain failed. No one argued against it. There was no removal, no ban, no announcement. The system simply favored what fit the new rhythm. Manoomin remained where it had always been, rooted in water renewing itself, slowly following patterns that no longer aligned with the way food was being organized. Most people adjusted without noticing. They chose what was available, affordable, and familiar. And as they did, a food that once sustained entire communities stepped quietly aside, not erased, but no longer central to the table. Questions began to surface much later, asked not by memory but by measurement. When researchers eventually looked more closely at this grain, they were not searching for something new. They were trying to understand why it had sustained people so steadily for so long. What they found was not dramatic, but it was consistent. Measured side by side, wild rice carries nearly twice the protein of common white rice, about 14 to 15 grams per 100 grams, compared to roughly 7 grams. It also contains substantially more dietary fiber, the kind that slows digestion and extends the feeling of fullness. People often describe the effect in simple terms: meals made with it last longer, not heavier, just steadier. Minerals tell a similar story. Analyses show higher levels of magnesium, phosphorus, and zinc, elements the body uses quietly day after day to support muscles, bones, and metabolism. Nothing here works quickly. Nothing spikes. The nourishment arrives at a pace that mirrors how the grain itself grows. Water plays a role in this too. Growing in shallow lakes and slow rivers, the plant matures over a longer season. Roots remain cool and submerged. Nutrients are drawn in gradually, not forced. That slower development shapes the structure of the grain, denser, firmer, more deliberate. Science can describe this now with charts and tables, but the conclusion is simple: time leaves a signature. Dietary studies that focus on satiety echo what experience once taught. Foods higher in protein and fiber tend to reduce hunger between meals. They ask the body to slow down. In that sense, this grain behaves the way it was grown, patiently. There is no discovery here in the modern sense, only recognition. The measurements confirm what tradition practiced without numbers. A food shaped by water and time tends to nourish in the same way. Science did not rewrite the story. It quietly caught up to it, and then stepped aside, leaving the story where it has always belonged. By the time the measurements were taken and the charts were drawn, many families had already moved on. Not out of neglect, but out of necessity. Life had grown faster, kitchens grew quieter. Meals became something to manage rather than something to gather around. Foods that asked for patience slowly slipped from daily use. Yet memory has a way of holding on. Somewhere a grandparent still remembers the feel of a slower meal, a pot that stayed on the stove a little longer, ingredients that were handled with care because they mattered. These were not recipes written down. They were habits learned by watching and repeated without explanation. The land remembers as well. Water remembers the seeds it once carried. In the shallows of certain lakes, this grain still returns when conditions allow, rising, falling, renewing itself the way it always has. Not because it was preserved, but because it was never truly gone. Knowing what we know now does not require us to change everything. It only asks us to notice, to recognize that some foods carried more than nourishment. They carried a way of moving through the world slower, steadier, more attentive. If this story brought back a memory of how food once felt in your family, you're not alone. Many of us were raised closer to these rhythms than we realize. Did someone in your family gather, or prepare food like this? If this stirred a quiet memory, you may already know who to share it with. Ancestral Garden is not about returning to the past. It's about keeping what mattered close enough to remember.